For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. The Rewilding podcast is made possible by donations from patrons. Please consider becoming a patron and support the podcast. Today I'm chatting with Clementine Morrigan, a prolific writer and podcaster who covers a range of topics. In this conversation, we talk about cancel culture and call-out culture and the challenges of transcending punishment and imprisonment in order to move toward a more egalitarian, transformative justice process when conflict arises, as it inevitably does, in our communities. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to just introduce yourself really quick and kind of give a little bit of background?
For sure. So my name is Clementine Morrigan, and I'm a writer primarily. I make zines for a living. That's basically what I do. So I do a number of different kinds of writing, and I publish books and stuff. I'm like an independent writer, so my work is like primarily self-published. And then I kind of blew up on Instagram. So I sort of have like an Instagram following of people who know my work that way. And then the other thing that I do is I host a podcast called Fucking Canceled. And so some of my work in the last few years has been on cancel culture. So there's like some of my audience knows me more for that topic. I oppose cancel culture. I am also an abolitionist. So like a lot of I see opposition to cancel culture as like a part of what it means to be an abolitionist, even though there's a lot of people who claim to be abolitionists who are like really into cancel culture. So I'm kind of a controversial figure. I think that's like probably a pretty good introduction. I don't know if there's anything important that I missed.
No, that sounds great. Yeah. I was trying to remember how I came across your work. And it's definitely through Instagram, but I can't remember if somebody else must have shared one of your posts or something. And then I started following it, and I've just really appreciated everything that you write about. And I had to get your zine, Fuck the Police Means We Don't Act Like Cops to Each Other.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, from my perspective, so I just want to wrap it in and kind of say how this relates to the concept of rewilding overall.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that, to me, rewilding is about, I don't know, it's hard for me to say it in a nutshell, but people who have been listening kind of get it. The idea that we evolved in a particular social setting over millions of years, and that social setting is much more egalitarian and scaled down from what we have today. And so I think that social skills, a lot of times in rewilding, people focus on things like ancestral skills like basket weaving or hide tanning or whatever. And social skills kind of get ignored or left at the wayside. To me, that's like the central core of our existence is our socialness. And so in order to have a society that is more aligned with, I think, our humanity, we have to be willing to embrace conflict and work through it towards like transformative justice. And so to me, your work was like very, very important in that connection to that part of our humanity. in particular because I, as a public figure, have experienced harassment of multiple kinds over the years,
Mhm.
for both mistakes that I've made and things that I've never even done that are just
Yeah.
like completely made up. Um, and so I think I was just really, I'm just really thankful and feel grateful for your work, because it's definitely putting a spotlight on a lot of the stuff that is super fucked up, particularly in the left, obviously. And so in that vein, I'm curious. I know like there's people who say like cancel culture doesn't exist
Mhm.
or that it's overblown. And I'm wondering how, I think maybe it comes down to definitions, like understanding what it is that we're
Right.
even
Yeah,
talking about. So I'm
totally.
curious how you define cancel culture.
Yeah. So basically, cancel culture, I think that, you can talk about it in a few different ways, but it is um campaigns of harassment that happen largely on the internet. I think that there is cancel culture that can exist, for example, also on the right. Like there's a book that's called So You've Been Publicly Shamed,
Mm-hmm.
by John Ronson, I think his name is. And he talks about a few different sort of examples of people having like huge public shaming spectacles happen on the internet. And some of those came out of like conservative or more right-leaning contexts. So it's not a phenomenon that exclusively exists on the left, but I think on the left we have a very intense sort of obsession with this kind of behavior, or we've really normalized this kind of
Mm-hmm.
behavior. And so cancel culture can take place in a lot of different ways, but generally what happens is that a person is called out. And there was like a shift from language around call out culture to cancel culture, but I actually think that that shift in language represents a shift in what actually happens. Because now it's the call out is not, it doesn't function sort of like separate from the individual. Once a person has been marked, the harassment continues and continues and continues indefinitely, right? And so cancellations can be from anything ranging from like really minor things, like people being upset about like how much somebody posted about a certain political topic, or feeling that they didn't post about a certain political topic on their Instagram in the right way or something. Or it can be about like much more serious things like allegations of abuse or sexual violence and things like this. In either case or anywhere along that spectrum, what usually happens is that there's some kind of public allegation made. Um, there's really intense language that is used. So people are getting, you know, called really intense things. Sometimes those words like match the accusation if they're being called out for something that is like really serious. Sometimes it seems like a very huge overstatement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's like a series of behaviors that follow from that. And so, like, one of the key and important components about what cancel culture is, and this is like really, really important for the people who think that it doesn't exist, is that it isn't just the person who is targeted who is harassed, but it is everyone who is associated with them. And this is very important because a lot of people will say cancel culture doesn't exist, it's just consequences. And so what that means is that people are just willingly and of their own free will deciding that they don't want to support this person's work anymore. And like, it's fine if a person, decides like, if I like an Instagram account and then they start posting stuff that I don't really vibe with and I decide I want to unfollow them, that's not me canceling them, right? But if
Totally.
I make a post that says this Instagram account is so fucked up because now they're posting things that I don't agree with, and then I start tagging other people who I know are following them and saying, what is wrong with you? I'm watching you. Why are you doing this? If I start like sliding into the DMs of every person who's associated with this person, like their friends, their community, even just people who are following them online, and basically demand that those people also, quote, hold this person accountable in the way that I have deemed correct, that's what I'm talking about with cancellation. And so it creates this impossible situation, because basically it's like the mob, like sometimes the original accusers, those they have coerced into joining them, and also just like random other people who have just jumped on board, are now all coming together to try to force this person to do what they want. And often what they claim to want is for the person to, quote, be accountable. And they can give a bunch of things that they're demanding for what that person needs to do to be accountable. But if you are like really in these scenes and watching this stuff, you will see that basically, I have never seen someone successfully be accountable because
Totally.
no matter what they do, it's not enough, right? So
Yep.
people will do some of the things that were asked. They will like make a statement. They will, and I've seen it go really, really far with people trying to do everything that's been asked of them, and
No.
still they always find a reason to criticize and just like make the cancellation worse. It's like now not only are you being canceled for the original thing, but now you're being canceled also because you weren't accountable in the exact correct way. But they're always shifting the goalpost.
Totally.
Right? Yeah. So that's like the basic phenomenon, but it gets really intense. It can totally bleed into people's real lives. People can like lose employment. They can not only lose their current job, but also find it difficult to find employment because now when you Google their name, all this like really intense stuff comes up about them. They can lose like their real life community. So it's like in a very real way, it's like taking away people's material security. And then another key and important part is that you're not allowed to defend yourself in any way. So if the accusations against you are not true, if they're just simply not true, or if they're like highly overstated, and you try to say that, that will also be used against you as a further accusation that you're refusing to be accountable. But it's like you absolutely should not be accountable for something that you didn't do. That's absurd, right? Why would you say that you did something that you didn't do? So like built right into it is this idea that like all accusations are immediately true, and anyone who questions that is like an apologist. And I think that you could see how this does not line up with the politics of abolition. But for some reason, that contradiction is just totally ignored by most people who are practicing this who claim to be abolitionists. So I don't know if that was like
Totally. Yeah, no, that's great. I think for me, I've always been like, I mean, I've participated in many cancellations, so as well as, being canceled. And there's a part of me that's like, my brain just doesn't, it has a hard time understanding the difference between when am I being, I mean, I tend to, I tend to speak hyperbolically a lot about shit, right? Like I'm an exaggerator by like my storytelling nature. And so there's a part of me that's like, okay, I have to get better at, not exaggerating particular things, but also how do I maintain my cultural criticism of particular practices and things without it turning into like this big cancellation thing. Um, at the same time, what do you do? So that's kind of it's I guess that I can just that little bite-sized thing is like what's the difference between cancel culture or going after somebody with these kinds of accusations and just like a cultural criticism,
Yeah.
like
So
critiquing people.
yeah. So I think that the main difference, I mean, if we're talking, because there's different kinds of cancellations, and I think that the response of what we should do instead, it depends on what the person is being canceled for. But if we're talking on the sort of like ideological side of things, right, where it's like you're taking issue with this person's ideas, for example, you don't agree with the ideas that they're putting forward. You think that those ideas are not good for the world or whatever. You have a political issue with like the ideas that they're putting forward. I think that we can critique the ideas, like we can totally critique the ideas while still like completely respecting the humanity, the dignity, the autonomy of the person involved, right? So, if a person is just like, I really disagree with Clementine Morgan's ideas and wanted to write like an essay in which they like responded to a paper that I wrote, and they like went through and were like, these are the arguments that I have with this with what Clementine was saying. That's not cancellation. That's just disagreeing with me and stating why. And that is actually like discourse. That is actually like how, we like get to think through ideas collectively. I do think that cancel culture has made it much more difficult to do that well now, because if you were to write that paper and just leave it at that and say, these are the reasons that I disagree, blah, 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 that's fine. But if you also say, and so therefore Clementine Morgan is fucked up, and so therefore anybody who still supports this person is fucked up, that is cancel culture. And so like, and unfortunately, because of cancel culture and because it's become so pervasive, I think sometimes when people are genuinely giving critique, others sort of respond as if they're being called to take part in a cancellation. Because we almost have like lost the skill for just critiquing someone's ideas without having to like damn the person,
Mm-hmm.
And so like if someone were to say like, and I've even, like I've disagreed with a thinker, for example. I'm not going to say like any particular thinker, but just like I'll be talking to someone and be like, yeah, like I like this person's writing, but like I don't agree with this particular thing or whatever. And then I noticed this like weird vibe in the person where they're kind of like, oh, like, is that person problematic? Like, am I problematic because I was saying I like this person's writing?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, actually, the person is not problematic. You're not problematic. It's fine. Like, it's just that I disagree with this like thing, and maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't agree with it. Like, we could talk about it. It's actually fine if we don't agree, because like one of the really intense things that happens on the left that is mind-boggling to me is that people act as if we have arrived at a consensus about like how to deal with like really complex social and political issues, when in reality, all throughout history and including today, leftists don't agree on things. We can all hold like very like similar core values about like equity, and about like wanting to get rid of hierarchy, and about like wanting to like, get rid of capitalism or
Totally.
whatever, and fundamentally disagree about like what it would look like to get there and how
Yep.
that should be done, right? And that's fine. Like, that's actually part of what it means to be a leftist. So I think it's like, critique is fine, but like what I watch for is making it personal, and especially doing any kind of coercive thing where you're like threatening other people for liking that person's work or engaging with that
Totally.
person's work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I think about like this this strange thing of like being in disagreement with somebody and how it's used, and I've done this where there's this sort of gray area for me of like, what's the difference between just disagreeing with somebody, and then if I feel that their disagreement is actually like causing harm or something, right? Like, there was an example that I pops into my head is there's a guy named Christopher Cantwell who is known as the Crying Nazi by Vice magazine. He was one of the organizers of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and apparently he has a blog. And there's a guy who uses the word rewilding also, who wrote a book. And in that book, he quoted Christopher Cantwell. That doesn't have anything to do, the quote didn't have anything to do with like, racism or whatever. It had to do with like state analysis. And, there's this, so there's this whole question of like dog whistling, or, is he a crypto fascist, and like, oh, they're associating with like what Vice has deemed neo-Nazis. And, there's this weird like invisible thread. And I feel like this idea of crypto fascists, or like secret racists, or biased, even just like biased people who don't understand their racism, there's like this gradient, that goes all the way in that direction. And so there's this like anger that comes from the left of like all of that, that feels like it's doing harm, right? And it doesn't see particular things as disagreements. It sees them as like detrimental to their existence or something along those lines. And so I don't know, like, and that's where I'm like, well, I participated in part of canceling this person who I think, has posted some egregious things, but they just did this weird association with somebody who has posted more along the lines of that sort of gradient or that way of thinking,
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess I'll say a couple things in response to that. The first thing is that I think that because we live under cancel culture, and we see the way that we treat people who have, quote, done harm, which is very vague, but
Totally.
that once we've decided that someone is harmful, we see the way that they're treated. So I think that a lot of people get stressed out when I start to say that cancel culture is an example of, quote, doing harm, because then they start to think, oh no, have I done harm? And so then they're like, that means, I guess, that horrible things are going to happen to me, because this is how we treat people who, quote, do harm, right? And so my whole thing is that I'm like, we're stepping outside of that whole paradigm, right? And like, one of the things that I talk about in my work is that I have participated in cancellations. Like, I have participated in ostracizing people. I have participated in, just like ranging from like, just not wanting to be canceled myself, and so like distancing myself from people, to like more active things. I wrote an article about how I called my ex-partner abusive, and like I didn't do it on the internet, fortunately, but I did say that to like a bunch of people, and like I did genuinely believe that they were, because like I had been sort of given this idea about abuse that basically if I was in an unhappy relationship and my needs weren't being met, that was an example of emotional abuse. And so I did share that information, and I can see that now looking back on it, and like, you know, having done work in therapy and having talked to trustworthy people, I understand that that relationship was not abusive. It was just an unhappy relationship. And I was in a culture that encouraged me to frame it that way. And so I did. And that obviously had repercussions for my ex-partner, you know, and I have like made amends for that and stuff. But the reason that I say that is just to be like, I really don't want critiques of cancel culture to also become this other place of purity and like pointing fingers and being like, oh, I'm so great because I don't cancel people, because it just reproduces the same thing, right?
Totally.
And so like we're all navigating complex stuff, like from ranging from interpersonal issues to like political stuff, and it's heavy and it's a lot, and I invite people to do the best that they can, and to extend as much compassion to themselves and to others as possible while doing this work. In terms of like, you know, is somebody dog whistling about being a Nazi or something? Like, I don't know, you know, and I think like probably a more productive route, if possible, would be to like talk to the person about what that was about and like why they're quoting this person's work. Are they aware of this person's work? Et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that's possible in this situation or whatever, but like that would probably be my sort of response if I knew the person and was able to have a conversation with them about it. Because who knows, like it could be a whole range of things. I don't know. In general, like, so this kind of leads into like the question of censorship, like when is censorship okay and is censorship cancellation? So I'll just say a little bit about what I think about that. And basically, so I'm actually very strongly in favor of free speech. And the reason for this is because it's a very slippery slope, right? Like we don't all agree actually on what is harmful. I think that everyone on the left can agree that Nazism is harmful, but lots of other things we don't agree on, right? And so it can become this slippery slope where it's like if a person is just saying this is harmful, like a good example of this is a scholar I really like, Adolf Reed, who is a socialist. He was like kicked out of a DSA event because people think that his ideas are harmful. And he is an anti-racist, like socialist, Black scholar, you know, very firmly on the left. And other leftists don't like his ideas. And so he was like banned from speaking at like a socialist event. And this I have a huge problem with. I'm like, you might not agree with his framing around racism and anti-racism, but he is a leftist and he has the right to speak his ideas, you know? So that's just an example. But so in one of the episodes of Fucking Canceled, we talk about the difference between intervention and punishment. And intervention is the act of stopping violence, right? So a simple example to demonstrate the difference is like, I'm not allowed to like hold someone forcibly against their will, because that would be a violation of their bodily autonomy, right? But if that person is about to punch someone else in the face, that would be an exception. I could violate that person's bodily autonomy and like hold them so that they don't punch the other person in the face. That's intervention. I think that intervention, for the most part, is applicable to like material situations of violence, not to rhetorical ones. But I do make the exception for rhetorical acts that call for violence. So this is where I think that censoring Nazis is okay, because Nazis are actually making rhetorical calls towards genocide. And so when you are making rhetorical acts that are actually about the most profound violation of other human beings' bodily autonomy, aka killing them, that's where I'm like, it is actually intervention to like prevent these people from organizing and so on. So that's what I think about that. Somebody else quoting this guy about a different thing, I feel like it gets a bit more like, okay, like why is he quoting this particular guy? And so on. And I think the whole dog whistling thing, it shows like we're in such a time of like not that it's unjustified, but we're in like such a paranoid time, right?
Totally.
Like we're always like, oh my God, like are people dog whistling? And like people like conspiracy theories are like a whole thing now. And like everything is really intense, you know? I like to just try to be as straightforward as possible to kind of combat that stuff and to just say very directly what I think. And to also try to extend as much good faith as possible that other people are doing the same. And I think I would just be like, why did you do that? And like, what are your reasonings for it? But
Hmm.
that's my long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, um, I did actually converse, or other people conversed with this person. And, I think it still comes down to, what you were saying in regards to like responding to someone's ideas. Like you can respond to somebody saying something like that
Mhm.
without calling for harassment. You
Yeah.
could say like, here's why it's maybe not a great idea to be quoting this person, right? Like and you could even publicly say that without being like, and this is why you should go after them and not ever listen to them or
Exactly.
whatever, like, and I think, yeah, I think it just comes down to that kind of thing where um, here's why you shouldn't do that. It's the same kind of thing as responding to an idea as much as it is like, um, you know, the medium is the message or whatever, right? So like I'm not actually, if I'm against cancellations or harassment, then I'm not going to do that in order to get to
Totally.
the point. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if I'm kind of
Yeah, and I
babbling
think
there,
like
but
a great example of this like is literally like, I think that people who cancel other people are doing great harm in the world. I strongly oppose their behavior. I talk to like hundreds of people because of where I'm positioned, doing my podcast, who have experienced like the most insane things, right? Like I've talked to people who have like lost everything in their lives, like who have developed PTSD from like the incessant harassment that they're experiencing. I take it very seriously. I know that lots of people just try to pretend that this isn't real, but it is real and it's really abusive and it's really wrong. Like I so strongly abhor this behavior. And at the same time, like I practice my principles, meaning that I critique the behavior and not the human beings. And in fact, I never name my cancelers. I never name them back. And the reason for this is because we've created such a dysfunctional culture that even though I am so opposed to cancel culture, because I have the size of the platform that I have, if I were to name these people and to be like, this is what these people have done to me, this is the profound, incessant harassment that they have created in my life, this is what they have taken from me, like, this is how severe it has been for me, and these are their names, I would not be surprised if some people decided to take it upon themselves to act out
totally.
their idea of justice upon
Exactly.
these people.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I actually can't stand for that. And so I won't name them, I will not name them. And because I don't want somebody else to just because once it gets out there, it runs away from you, right?
Totally.
And I can't
Absolutely.
control what people are going to do.
Yeah.
And of course, like I'm not responsible for somebody else's actions, but I do know ahead of time that like it's quite possible that that would happen, and I would just rather that it didn't. And also, I'm perfectly able to talk about why what they're doing is wrong without naming them. So that's just what I
Yeah.
do, you know?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I think so the first time I experienced, call out sort of cancellation, whatever the harassment was years ago, there was uh, this incident when I was a blogger that led to, it was a cascade of things that happened where, and it's now forever memorialized in my friend Lisa's book, Believers, that just came out, which is sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on and talk about this specifically was to sort of address some of the things that are talked about in that chapter, that revolved around this thing that happened, which was that I received a rock in the mail, a giant rock. And it was at a punk house I had just moved into. I had actually didn't even know the address yet. And so somebody figured out where I was living, was angry enough to send me a giant rock anonymously with an insult attached to it. To basically just say, like, you don't know who I am. I know where you live and I don't like you and I'm willing to do this thing, right? And so like I sat everybody down, like I called a house meeting and I was like, look, this thing happened. Somebody here in the house had to have given somebody the
Right,
address or told them that I was here, right? That's
right.
the only way this would have happened. And nobody wanted to actually do anything about it. Nobody was willing to kind of figure that out, right? And so I also, just being naive in terms of the function of the police, like called the non-emergency line and was like, hey, I'm receiving like anonymous harassment. Is there a way of keeping a record of this in case it escalates? And they basically laughed at me and hung up. And I was sitting there kind of like, oh, right. What the fuck am I doing? Like, this is not the function of the police. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was just sad and desperate. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I was scared. I'd never dealt with this kind of uh, thing before. And so as a blogger, like I'm transparent and I write about the things that I do. So I wrote on my blog that I had done that, and somebody took it, copied the whole blog and put it on anarchistnews.org with the headline
Wow.
"Urban Scout is a snitch," which was my alias, or my
Oh,
my online Urban Scout is a snitch, right? And so then it's just like hundreds of comments of people like, "Oh, fuck this guy, he's a fucking snitch," blah blah blah. Like they started, like I shut down my website because people were like coming there, and this is like
yes.
10 years ago, right? um so as time went on, like I wrote a bunch about that experience. I wrote about how it was a not as, I don't even think of it as a mistake. It was just pointless to call the non-emergency police. Like there's no reason to do
Yes.
it whatsoever. But there's no, like, it's like the so you've been publicly shamed. It makes me think of how shaming people publicly is like a sticky thing. People love doing that, but then when you even come back with like an apology or talk about what happened, like nobody cares or
No,
remembers or shares that information, right?
no, no.
So I went on a book tour a couple of years later, and I had done some investigation on my own into the origins of the package, and I figured out a lot of things, including the identity of the person who sent it. um, I didn't do anything with that information. I needed to know for my
Right.
own purpose, right? um, which, strangely enough, the people who I ended up getting a phone call from Lear Keith, who I was friends with at the time. I don't know if you're familiar with Lear's work. She
No.
wrote a book called The Vegetarian Myth. She's a radical feminist. I don't subscribe to her ideology anymore. She's considered a TERF by a lot of people. But at the time, we were friends, and she called me because she had been pied with a cayenne pepper pie at an anarchist book
Whoa.
fair um, in Oakland area, which is where the package had been shipped from.
Right.
And they had filmed it with a camera like in the audience and then put it on YouTube under the user account name Peter Bauer. So it was like the same people who were harassing her were harassing me.
Okay.
And we had a conversation about it. And I didn't really end up giving her as much information as I had because I was afraid that what she wanted to do was go to like the FBI. So I did give her some stuff, but then later found out more things on my own. I don't know what she ended up doing. I do not engage or talk to those folks anymore. But um, you know, uh, I ended up going to Oakland for my book tour, and I kept joking with my girlfriend that I kept looking over at my car to make sure that it was okay. Because I knew that's where this package had come from like years before.
Mhm.
And so we went out to eat before I was supposed to give my reading, and I came back and my tires were slashed, my windshield was smashed, and they
Yeah.
had wrote snitch on the side of my car, which my car is a piece of shit. I mean, it was totaled. The value of my car was less than all new tires and a windshield and the, you know, and also at that night, there was a guy who was coming from North Atlantic Press, who was one of the publishers there, who was going to come to my reading to see if they wanted to like pick up my book, right? And so he gets there, and there's my car like destroyed, and I'm like, I can't do this reading now. Like I have to figure out how to like it was a Friday night, so like auto shops were going to be closed over the weekend, and how was I going to tow my car and like all this stuff. So he was basically like, okay, yeah, this is kind of like too controversial for us anyway. So sorry, I'm taking off. Um, I, it's just like a cascade of things, right? Where it's like this, uh, it goes from sort of this idea of being harassed online to actually like a physical thing that hurt me financially. I
Yeah, it's a
was
really
able to
intense thing.
recover. I took a picture of the of my totaled car and put it on Facebook with a PayPal link, and I was like, "Yo, I'm on my book tour. My car got destroyed. Like, can you help?" And enough people donated that actually covered the cost of the repairs as well as a rental car for the so I could actually continue my tour and then get my car on the way back up.
Wow.
Um, But it was just this thing where, and even, so this is now 10 years ago.
Okay, wow.
Um, but even just like a few weeks ago, somebody messages me on Instagram and they're like, or they commented on one of my things. It's like, oh, you fucking piece of shit. You're the fucking asshole who called the cops. You fucking snitch or whatever. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, did you not read like all of the things I've written about that since then? Are you like, I just blocked them because they're not actually interested. They're literally there just to
Yeah,
continue harassing people. Right.
yeah,
And so there's just this like, I don't know. It's like you said earlier, like in terms of accountability, it's never enough,
no,
right?
no, it's never enough. And also, like, I mean, like opposing the police or being an abolitionist, the idea that we should treat people who have in any way engaged with the police with the same level of, anger that people have towards the institution of the police seems very crazy to me. Um, Lots of people have been involved with the police for lots of reasons. Because we live in a culture where there's police. Like, I'm just
Right.
like, we live in a culture where there's police. Lots of people turn to the police. What you did sounds incredibly minor.
Right.
And it sounds incredibly minor. And that sounds like a very intense, like, response. But of course, things get like passed through the grapevine with no
Right.
information, right?
Totally.
Calling you a snitch sounds like you went to the cops and like
Right.
gave someone's name and like
Exactly.
to them going to jail,
Exactly. Exactly.
as opposed to you like, calling the non-emergency line about receiving like a
Right.
threatening package.
Yeah.
But like I can relate because I mean nothing that intense happened to me with people like what they did to your car. That's very extreme. But I'm an abolitionist. I talk about being an abolitionist. I'm also a survivor. I talk about being a survivor. Um, and when I was in my early 20s, was in an abusive relationship, a very severe abusive relationship where I experienced like a huge amount of physical violence and like was in danger for my life, and I pressed charges against my ex. I pressed charges against him. There was a trial, and like I share about that vaguely in my work. I don't go into like details that I don't want to go into because it's obviously like a very intense and personal thing for me,
Totally.
but like I talk about it and I talk about the fact that that is part of what made me an abolitionist, right? Because it's like at the time and where I was at in my life, I was, an alcoholic. I'm still an alcoholic, but I was drinking then. I did not have I didn't have friends. I didn't have community. I had a boyfriend who put my body through a wall, and who was, stalking me after I had managed to get him out of the house. He had broken in after I had managed to get him out. Like I was in danger. And that, whatever, like the police ended up getting involved and like I went forward with it. Also, like when I was seeking out like domestic violence support from like a domestic violence like agency organization in my city, they like highly encouraged me to go forward with pressing charges because that's the sort of like the model of like domestic violence like
Totally.
organizations. That's what they do. And at the time I was just like, I don't know what to do. Like they're telling me that this is what I should do.
Hmm.
I'm going to do it, And so I mean, I didn't like the cops. I had cops break and enter into my apartment
Right.
when I was younger. Like I have woken up with 2 police officers standing over my bed while I'm like sleeping naked in my bed, So like I didn't like the cops either then, but I was not like, a very educated, cool anarchist. I was a drunk and I didn't know any better than what I was doing and I didn't have a lot of options, right? So whatever, like I did what I did. After that, like knowing what I know now, I wish I had had other options. Like I would definitely not make the same choices again. It makes me really sad because I know that my ex is severely traumatized and that is why he is the way that he is. And I know that him going to jail is like contributing to that. Him having police interventions is contributing to that. I know that that completely like perpetuates the cycle of abuse and it's
Totally.
something that I'm against. And at the same time, like, yeah, so some cancelers like tried to cancel me for this. They like brought that up and they're like, Clementine Morrigan like pretends to be an abolitionist, but do you know this about her? And it's like, well, yeah, like people have complicated lives.
Yeah.
Like politics is not about purity. It's not about me standing somewhere and saying I have never done anything that I regret. Like it's about me being like I'm a human being who's learning along the way. And my politics like come out of those experiences of learning. And like I share what I have learned so that I can help other people, so that hopefully people don't have to have the same crazy twisting, turning experiences that I had to get to the same place. But it's like, yeah, it's just totally crazy. So I'm just like, yeah. And then also like what I just can't understand, and like I really do try to think about it and understand, but to me, I'm like, obviously abolitionism is about wanting to abolish the police and wanting to abolish prisons. But why? And the reason why, and at least for me, is a deeper, like kind of, I don't know, ethical, spiritual, like reason that has to do with it's wrong to dehumanize people.
Totally.
Like it is wrong to dehumanize people. It is wrong to define people by their worst mistakes. It is wrong to treat people like they're guilty without ever giving them a chance to defend themselves. It is wrong to take away people's freedoms. It is wrong to like to mark someone and permanently define them in this two-dimensional way when they are in fact a full complex human being. And those are the things that the carceral system does, and that is why I oppose it, you know, because I believe that human beings deserve to be treated better than that, regardless of what they have done. And that is like a deeply held belief that I have. So the idea that people can be abolitionists and not be happy when the cops are doing these things, but think it's totally fine when we do these things to each other is just totally bizarre to me.
Totally.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think too, you know, like when the incident with the rock happened at my house and I called everybody together for a meeting, um, it's like the title, you know, fuck the police means we don't like act like cops to each other. How is it giving away my address to somebody who wantingly wants, you know, who's going to harass me?
Yeah.
That's a fucking COINTELPRO tactic. You know what I mean? That's like, that's literally snitching, not to the police, but to people who wish to do me harm, right? They gave my name, my address
Yeah.
to somebody who's then going to fuck with me. Like that is actually cop behavior. So why is it that that wasn't a thing, but the me calling a non-emergency line and getting hung up on because it was stupid is, you know what I mean? It
Yeah.
just perpetuates this idea.
Totally.
Um, one of the things I have the most challenge with as an abolitionist, I mean, I guess for me, it's hard to define myself as an abolitionist because there's an irreconcilable thing that's going on in my head, right? Like I'm against prison, I'm against captivity, but there, but then that there's always this but, right? Like the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, right? Like, what do we do with those people? Like, is it, you know, can you treat someone humanely who is untreatable? I don't know. And are there, you know, there was a book that I read called The Sociopath Next Door, which is a very pop cultural book about sociopathy, you know. But her whole thing is she gives like, you know, several different types, like archetypes of sociopaths, which, you know, basically, again, it's I say pop culture because it's probably reliant upon the diagnostic, you know, what the DSM or whatever it's called, you know, and I don't particularly subscribe to that either. But my question, you know, like how do we work then with people who are potentially non rehab not who cannot have rehabilitation, you know what I mean, like who are just serial offenders or compulsive liars to a fault, and it isn't perhaps because of like non-repairable literally brain damage that they've experienced either, you know, in life or in some form of genetics or development or something like that. I don't know.
So I guess like the first thing that I'll say is that like, you know, I don't think that having concerns or reservations or not having the answer for like what we would do if we didn't have prisons means that you can't be an abolitionist. I'm not also telling you you have to be an abolitionist, but I'm just saying that I don't think that is what abolitionism means, because it doesn't mean that we have all the answers. It just means that we are committed to an ethic that does not see human beings as disposable, that rejects punishment, that highly values like freedom and autonomy, and sees the prison system as reprehensible, right? And then from there, it's like, how do we move towards that goal, right? What would that look like? And it's a long-term plan. Like, it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But I would say, like, the first thing is that the majority of people who are in prison didn't fucking like,
Right.
they are not what you're describing, right?
Exactly.
There's a lot of people who are in prison for nonviolent crimes. There's a lot of people who are in prison for violent crimes, but there's a lot of like, it's not like a compulsive, deeply seated part of their personality or something. Then there's also the question of trauma, like my ex I was talking about. There's a huge amount of people who are caught up in the cycle of trauma. And in fact, trauma therapy is actually very successful in helping people to change their behaviors, right? So there's that. Then there's also poverty, right? Like, how much crime is caused by poverty?
Totally.
Like, hugely, both nonviolent and violent crime is caused by poverty. So to me, like, being an abolitionist fundamentally means being a socialist, because it means that we have to be committed to meeting people's needs, because if people's needs are met, there is going to be a lot less of what we call crime, right? In terms of like, what are we going to do about, serial killers?
Right. Yeah.
Like, that's like a big question. I think that they are these types of people who do really, really fucked up shit and also have no regret about it and just want to continue doing that. I think that they are a small minority of people who end up doing fucked up shit. And so I don't have an answer for that. But I think that not having an answer for that doesn't mean that we can't be moving in a direction,
Totally.
and it is something that I think about. And I think a lot about, like, I'm very critical of like psychiatry. Part of my abolitionism comes from my experiences of being locked in psych wards. So I'm very like suspicious of like medical models, sort of like essentialist framings of people that they have to, they just are this way. And like, I don't know, I once kind of, I can't remember why this was happening, but somebody was talking about, I think, I guess psychopath, sociopath, like these types of ideas. And they were talking about serial killers. And like, I don't like reading about serial killers. Like, I find that kind of stuff disturbing, but there was a serial killer operating in Toronto, which is the city that I'm from. And there was a serial killer operating in Toronto while I was living in Toronto, actually. He was killing gay men, and he killed them over a period of like many years before he was caught. I think he killed like 9 men. Anyway, it was obviously very, very disturbing. And the community knew that something was going on, and the police pretended like they were like, nothing is going on. And then eventually there was something going on, and they found that there was a serial killer. But anyway, I like looked into this guy when I was getting like, kind of triggered about these ideas about being a psychopath or whatever. And I just like looked him up. And I read a little bit about his childhood, and like, nobody says that he was abused, but there was like some pretty big red flags about the way that he acted when he was really young. And also the way that his son acted, like his son, when he was an adult and had a child, also acted in these certain ways. And some people might be like, well, that's obviously that there's like some like, thing being passed on genetically. But to me, I'm like, it really sounds like a cycle of child abuse. Like, it really sounds like his father was, or potentially another relative, but probably his father was doing something pretty fucked up to him. And then maybe he was doing something to his son. And then, most people don't end up being serial killers in that situation, but some do. And perhaps there's a genetic component. I don't know. It's definitely not my area of like research, but I, as like somebody who is really knowledgeable about trauma, and also knows like how much transformation is possible with people who have trauma and how traumatizing our world is, I'm kind of like, I really think we should investigate that line as far as possible.
Totally.
And see like what would happen if we had like trauma informed everything. If we really knew how to intervene in child abuse in an effective way, if we really knew how to like help people who have, are traumatized from things that have happened to them and are also traumatized from things that they have ended up doing. And like, that is the transformation. And like, that is what I really believe in and think we could see a huge amount of transformation. Whether or not that would totally get rid of the occasional problem of serial killers, I don't know, but I hope so, but maybe not. I don't know.
One thing that comes to my mind too is like, in the people who I've come across, I don't diagnose people, but the people I've come across in my life that have, where I feel I actually have to, I'm following the account Cursed Cancellations on Instagram, and it's one of
Yeah.
my favorite things, Um, but one of the things they joke about in there a lot is like, keeping Excel documents of the
Right.
receipts of like the infractions. There's actually 3 or 4 people who I actually have to track things because of their compulsive lying.
Right.
So I actually do track a lot of this stuff for my own protection in terms of accusations and things along those lines. But there's a question of some of these people are, professionals in the same capacity in the same worlds, and we overlap. And so when I hear that somebody's interacting with this person, there's a part of me that's like, I feel like I have a moral responsibility to warn other people going into these situations or going into the any kind of relationship with those people. But then I ask myself, but is that in a sense like part of the cancellation, right? I guess not necessarily if I'm like, don't interact with this person, but as much as it is like, what are your thoughts around this? Like, you've experienced this particular, relationship where, did you feel you had to warn other people or anything after the fact? Or like, how do you, what are your
Yeah,
thoughts around that?
that's a great question, because I think that a lot of times people, when they're doing cancellations, like very obvious cancellation spectacles on the internet, a lot of what they say is that they're claiming that they're warning people, like, or at least that's one of the justifications for cancellations. So, I mean, there's a couple of things, right? One is that we are never going to be able to warn everybody about everybody. It's not possible. Like, I'm not going to be able to know every single person who any other person might come across who might do something fucked up, because I don't know. I don't have all that information. And also, people do fucked up things for the first time all the time, So it is
Totally.
actually not possible to warn everybody about everything, right? And I mean, maybe that sounds obvious, but because of that, I'm like, is that even the best strategy for keeping people safe? Because that's what I'm more interested in, is like, how do we
Hmm.
increase our safety, right? And so what I would be more interested in doing, rather than, because I feel like it only kind of solves a small piece of the problem if I just go around warning about individual people who do things, right? And I'm not saying warning should never happen or that I'm always against it, but overall, I'm like, it really only kind of scratches the surface of a situation that is much bigger. And I think that there's more effective things. So one of those would be actually helping people, doing more like sort of like, first of all, everybody like access to like good therapy, access to trauma therapy, but also like interpersonal skills and like learning how to identify red flags of behavior, right? Because very often there are lots of red flags of behavior. It's just that people aren't necessarily seeing them for lots of reasons. So like my ex, for example, or people like him who are, very, and I mean, I'm saying all of this in the present tense. To be honest, I have no idea what his life is like today. I haven't spoken to him in many years. So what he was like then anyway. But like people who are like that, there's huge red flags. But because of the fact that I am a survivor of child abuse, because I am an alcoholic, because I was a very vulnerable person, those are the types of people who tend to get victimized by people who are abusive in that way, because we don't see the red flags because we're already traumatized, right? So like educating people, helping people to like have enough awareness, discernment, self-esteem, and the skills needed to communicate boundaries, and then to know what to do if those boundaries aren't respected, and so on. I think that if we gave people that kind of literacy and that kind of capacity, we would be much better off. And I think there's lots of ways that we could, as communities, invest in that kind of work, because I think a lot of people just don't really have those skills very well. And so I think that that kind of approach will be way more effective than just sort of warning people about specific people. In some situations, I think it can be important because, for example, like if you know that there's this guy who's like this, and you know that he's in spaces where there are a lot of vulnerable people who are likely not to see the red flag, talking to those people about it, giving them a heads up, might be a good idea. But I just also know that probably if somebody had warned me, I would have been like, yo, fuck you, because
Right.
that's where I was at.
Totally. Yeah.
So I don't even know how useful that would have been in reality. And so I don't really know if it would have helped. And so that's just the thing. I just don't know if it's that useful. People also need to make their own mistakes too. And like, in terms of like, like people need to like decide for themselves if a person is a good fit for them. And like, obviously there's extreme cases of abuse and stuff like that, but there's also just like other cases where it's like this person, I don't know, like with the lying thing, like I've had situations like that too, where I'm like, it seems to me that this person is compulsively lying to me. But I also was just sort of like, and I don't know, I'm not commenting on your situation because I don't know about it, but like, I also like came to the realization that like not everybody has like the same kind of relationship to honesty, and that for some people just sort of like kind of lying sometimes is just what they do, and that other people aren't that bothered by it. But I was really bothered by it. And so that's kind of like information for me that I'm like, maybe that's not the kind of person that I want to be building a relationship with. But for other people, sort of like lying about inconsequential things is fine or something. I don't know. They don't mind. So it's like, it isn't really for me to decide if that behavior is a problem for somebody else. And in some cases, it's like very objectively a problem, like if the person is being physically violent or something. But in other cases, it's like, it might be more subjective, and it might be more like each person needs to decide for themselves whether or not this behavior is actually a problem. And I think that the reason that this is so important is because taken to its logical ends in cancel culture, you can see that people think it's okay to warn people about stuff that is actually just fine. It's just
Totally.
the way that that person is. And it's not harmful. It's not abusive. It's just something that you personally don't like. And now you have decided that that person is harmful and abusive because they have a different kind of relationship style than you do. And so now you're going around warning everybody because you wish that you had been warned, but that, like the person isn't doing anything wrong. So I think it can be carried to like some pretty extreme places as well, which is why I'm also like kind of wary of the warning thing.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the people I was kind of the first one to walk away from that whole scene, and it's been almost 15 years now, and there's just it's sort of like their reputation precedes them.
Right.
And in that book, The Sociopath Next Door, her two things that she kind of says is essentially cut all ties with the person if possible. Obviously, that's hard to do with somebody who has like a child with somebody or something along those lines.
Right.
But cut all ties to protect yourself, because the best way to disengage from people like that is to just be as boring as possible to them. Um, but another thing that she says is like people who are serial offenders in particular ways, like they get found out eventually. Like people who are just compulsive liars, they will get found out and their reputation will precede them.
Well,
Um,
yeah, just like how you notice that somebody's lying, it's like other people will notice it too.
exactly.
And then those people, it's like up to them to decide
Exactly.
like if that's something that is like, that they want to create a boundary and not have the relationship, or if it's something that they're just like, huh, that's like weird behavior, but it for whatever reason doesn't bother
Totally.
them,
Yeah.
right?
And I think that you're really right when you say, that it's this level of unawareness of red flags and being able to sort of train in that kind of knowledge and even like intuition too, I think. And it's just essentially, I had to leave and basically create my own community from the ground after this thing happened. And I did it with that intention. And I feel like we've come a long way. And we've dealt with a lot of things, and we're like rooted in this process of transformative justice as a community around the nonprofit that I started, Rewild Portland, the board members in particular. And so it's just kind of cool to see that actually taking shape and being like, I think there's that saying along the lines of like, the best revenge is to like lead a good life. And I really feel like that's really true. And also to just, yeah, work on creating a community where those kinds of behaviors are something that people are aware of, so that you can potentially create boundaries that prevent those kinds of people from behaving in those ways, and maybe even rehabilitate people just through the cultural process itself, or the wider culture holding boundaries in those ways.
Yeah, I think for me, like just I think so often we have put there's like the idea of like the internal locus of control versus the external locus of control. And I think that in cancel culture, we have focused entirely externally, so that like my healing has to be about controlling this person who hurt me, right?
Totally.
Whereas it's like, instead I could accept that I don't actually have control over another person. And that it might suck because that person might have really hurt me. But what is in my control? And then I can focus on my own boundaries, right? And like making sure that I can enforce my boundaries. And like you said, building communities that do feel good, that do feel supported, like putting my energy into my own healing, etc. All of that has been so much more effective and helpful to me than like any kind of external focus of thinking that I'm going to get my healing through trying to control someone else's behavior.
Totally. Is there anything coming up that you'd like to promote?
I guess it kind of depends when this will go up. But I have a workshop coming up. I guess like the replay will still be available if people are. You think I would know exactly what my workshop is, but I don't. So I'm just quickly looking it up. But I'm having a workshop coming up that is about cancel culture. It's called Cancel Culture is Real and You Can Still Have a Beautiful Life. And it is for people who either have been canceled or people who their loved ones have been canceled, or people who are just like living in fear of being canceled because they're like a public figure, or they're like in these scenes and it's like really preventing them from like just being honest about what they think about things. So that's going to be October 21st. So coming up very soon, and it's 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But if this is coming out and that happened in the past, then the replay is still available. And you can find the link to it on my Instagram. So I feel like that is something that will be relevant to the conversation we just had. Otherwise, I have a book coming out really soon that's called Fucking Magic. And it's a collection of 12 issues of my Persian Fucking Magic. And it's kind of totally unrelated to the conversation we just had. Maybe slightly. There's some things in it that are related. It's about trauma, and it's a lot about like queer sexuality and like trying to like live your best life when you're like super traumatized. And so I'm hoping to have that book out in November. So if people are interested, you can also find out about that either on my Instagram, which is just Clementine Morrigan, or on my website, which is clementinemorrigan.com.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Clementine and that it inspired you to think more deeply about transformative justice and the way we treat each other as we rewild. Check out the podcast notes for links to Clementine's work. Please become a patron of the Rewilding podcast to show your support. You can help out with as little as $1 a month. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.